He was meant to uphold the law. For years he served in the uniforms of the Royal Navy, before becoming a police officer. People trusted him. Having served in law enforcement, he knew the rules, all the risks, and the weight of his choices. But somewhere along the way, he crossed over to the other side. Instead of protecting communities, he began helping to poison them. Working in the shadows, he joined forces with organised criminals who were moving millions of pounds worth of heroin across the UK, most notably in areas of Liverpool, Scotland and Wales. This is the story of how a trusted officer became a gangster, and how his choices led to shocking arrests of him and his associates. If you want to hear more stories about the rise and fall of criminals, subscribe to our channel where we expose them all. Stephen Creasey's story begins in Cardiff, where he grew up before taking the path that would define his early life: service. As a young man, he joined the Royal Navy. Life in the Navy was tough, but it gave him order and purpose. It meant long stretches away from home, strict rules, and the kind of discipline that shaped men to follow orders without question. Creasey adapted to that world. He became someone others could rely on, a man in uniform with a sense of duty to something bigger than himself. After the Navy, Creasey carried that sense of discipline into another role in public service. He joined the police. For years, he worked as an officer, a figure people turned to for safety. He had authority, the backing of the law, and a career that put him in the middle of the community. Like many officers, he wore the badge as a sign of trust. He was supposed to uphold the rules, to protect against the very crimes he would later commit. The exact details of his time in the police are less public, but what is clear is that he was once respected. He had the kind of background that commands respect in Britain: service in the armed forces followed by work in law enforcement. By his late 60s, many would have seen him as a man who had done his part for society. He had served his country and his community. But there was another side to that story. After leaving the force, Creasey stepped into civilian life. Many officers struggle with the transition. The uniform gives them identity and purpose. But once it's gone, some find it hard to adapt. Creasey's later choices would show that leaving the badge behind did not mean leaving the knowledge behind. He knew how policing worked, he knew the systems, and he knew what officers looked for when investigating crime. That knowledge would make him valuable to the wrong people. At this stage, though, Creasey was still seen as a man of service. He had lived a life defined by discipline and authority. In Cardiff, he was not known as a criminal, but as a former officer, someone who had spent years on the right side of the law. His story could have ended there, as one of many men who serve, retire, and live out their years quietly. But that is not how it unfolded. Instead, the life of service that began in the Navy and the police would become the very foundation for his downfall. The respect, the trust, and the knowledge gained in those years would later be twisted and used for crime. This first chapter of his life shows the sharp contrast that makes his fall so striking. From the outside, Creasey looked like a man who had done his bit, a man who had given years to the country. What came next would shock those who once saw him as a figure of respect. When Stephen Creasey left the police, he stepped into a different world. No uniform, no chain of command, and no clear sense of purpose. For many ex-officers, that shift can be hard. They go from structure and status to an ordinary life where their past role means little. Creasey was no different. By the time he was in his 60s, he was living in Cardiff. On paper, he looked like a man with a solid background: the Navy, the police, decades of service. But beneath that surface, he was restless. He no longer had the authority or the steady routine he once relied on. That gap between who he had been and who he was now opened the door to darker choices. It was during this time that Creasey began to cross paths with people linked to Liverpool's underworld. Criminal groups are always on the lookout for men like him, older, trusted, and able to move quietly without raising suspicion. A retired officer could slip under the radar, especially one who knew how police worked. Creasey fit that mold. Instead of walking away from crime, he leant into it. He became a courier for organised criminals, running drugs across long distances. It was a role that drew directly on his past. He knew how to look calm at checkpoints, how to mask nervousness, how to prepare a story if questioned. All the things he had once used in uniform were now turned against the law. The man who had spent years standing for order was now part of the chaos, and with every trip, he moved deeper into a world he once swore to fight. By the time Stephen Creasey had stepped into the world of organised crime, Liverpool was already a key hub in the UK's drug trade. For decades, the city had been a gateway for heroin and cocaine, with networks stretching across borders. Local crews had built links with suppliers abroad, and the flow of drugs through Merseyside reached into Scotland, Wales, and beyond. It was in this landscape that Creasey found his new role. The leaders of the network were men like Christopher Brannan and Stephen Hopkins, two Liverpool criminals who ran a large-scale heroin operation. They were the ones arranging the wholesale supply, bringing in kilos of heroin and controlling how it moved across the country. Around them was a wider team, trusted lieutenants, runners, and couriers. Creasey was one of those couriers. On the surface, it may have looked unusual, a man in his late 60s working for a Liverpool drugs crew. But to the gang, he was valuable. He had no obvious criminal record linked to the drug trade. He wasn't a teenager driving recklessly, or a known gang member being watched by police. He was older, calm, and respectable enough to avoid suspicion. If officers stopped him on the motorway, who would imagine that a retired policeman was carrying millions of pounds worth of heroin? Creasey's role was simple, but vital. He was responsible for moving the drugs between Liverpool, Cardiff, and towns in Scotland. The product would be handed to him in bulk, sealed, packed, and sometimes concealed in specially adapted cars. His job was to keep it moving, to deliver it without incident, and to make sure the operation continued to flow. At the other end, men like Kevin Thompson, Christopher Heaney, and Jeffrey Hickson handled distribution. Brannan's partner even helped with the money laundering, moving the proceeds through bank accounts to disguise the scale of profit. The structure was tight, and each person had their place. Creasey wasn't at the very top, but he wasn't a small-time player either. He was central to the transport system. That kept the network alive. The sums involved were staggering. Police later estimated that the group was responsible for moving around £7 million worth of heroin. This was not a side hustle or a petty operation. It was industrial in scale. Every trip Creasey made carried a risk, but also a reward for the group. His experience as an ex-officer gave them an edge. He understood road policing, how traffic stops worked, and what would draw attention. That knowledge allowed him to operate with confidence, at least for a time. In Liverpool, Brannan and Hopkins called the shots. In Cardiff, Creasey was the trusted courier, and together, they formed part of a pipeline that spread heroin from Merseyside to communities hundreds of miles away. But like all organised crime groups, the network had cracks. Police intelligence was building, and with every trip Creasey made up and down the motorways, the chances of slipping through unnoticed began to shrink. By the time Stephen Creasey was fully drawn into the network, his life had taken on a rhythm. Long drives on the motorway, hours behind the wheel, and journeys that stretched from Cardiff up to Liverpool and on to Scotland. He wasn't a street dealer or someone caught in petty crime. His role was quieter, less visible, but just as critical. He was the courier, the man trusted to keep the supply line moving. The gang made sure his runs were professional. His car had been fitted with a hidden compartment under the passenger seat, designed to store packages of heroin. These weren't clumsy hiding places. They were carefully built, concealed so well that at a glance, even a trained officer might miss them. Inside, the drugs were packed tight. In one case, 5 kilos of heroin and a kilo of adulterant, enough to stretch the supply and increase profits. Creasey carried a burner phone with him, used only for contact with the network. It kept communication short and to the point. No personal calls, no messages that could give him away. Everything about the setup showed how organised the gang was. This wasn't a one-off trip. It was part of a steady chain, moving drugs worth millions across the country. For Creasey, the job demanded calm. He had to blend in, to drive like any other man on the road. No speeding, no sudden movements, nothing that would make him stand out. He knew how police worked. He understood traffic patrols, checkpoints, and the questions officers might ask if he was stopped. That insider knowledge gave him confidence. Where others might panic, he could stay steady. Each journey carried risk. The roads between Wales, Liverpool, and Scotland are long and heavily policed. A simple stop for a broken light or a routine check could expose everything. But for a time, Creasey managed to slip through. to the gang. This made him all the more valuable. He was reliable, trusted to deliver without fuss. But the nature of courier work is unforgiving. Every trip increases the chance of being caught. Police intelligence teams build pictures over time, watching patterns, linking movements, and waiting for the right moment. For all his background and discipline, Creasey couldn't escape the fact that he was carrying heroin on Britain's motorways. What made his role stand out was the contrast. Here was a former police officer, someone who had once pulled over drivers himself, now hoping he wouldn't be pulled over. He knew exactly what could happen if the wrong officer with the right dog checked his car, and yet he kept going, run after run, convinced he could stay ahead of the system he had once been part of. For a while, it worked. But by May 2022, the run that mattered most would become the one that brought everything crashing down. By May 2022, police were already watching the network. Intelligence had been building for months. Investigators suspected that heroin was being moved between Liverpool, Cardiff, and towns in Scotland. They knew there was a supply line, and they were waiting for the chance to break it open. That chance came when Stephen Creasey was on the road. On that day, Creasey set off from Cardiff in a car fitted with the hidden compartment. His destination was Fife, a small town on Scotland's east coast. To him, it was another courier run, part of the pattern he had repeated before. But this time, officers were ready. As he drove north, Creasey was stopped by police in Scotland. To anyone else, it might have looked like a routine traffic check, but behind the scenes, the operation was far from routine. This was a planned stop, based on intelligence that drugs were being carried in the vehicle. Creasey was calm. He had experience of stops, both from his years as an officer and his time as a courier. But the difference this time was the dog. A trained sniffer dog was brought to the scene, and it quickly signaled towards the passenger side of the car. For investigators, that was the breakthrough. The car was searched, and the hidden compartment was uncovered. Inside, officers found 5 kilos of heroin and a kilo of adulterant, a cutting agent used to increase profits by diluting the drug before sale. Alongside the drugs, they also recovered a burner phone, linking Creasey directly to the network. The find was clear evidence that the suspicions were right. Creasey wasn't just a man on the road. He was part of a structured group, moving drugs on a large scale. His arrest marked the first visible crack in the operation. From that point, the investigation expanded. The bust became the trigger for Operation Solon, a joint effort led by Tarion, the regional organised crime unit in South Wales, alongside forces in Scotland and Merseyside. Warrants were carried out in Cardiff, Liverpool, Anstruther, Lochgelly, and Blyth. Officers seized more drugs, cash, jewellery, and drug paraphernalia. The wider group, Brannan, Hopkins, Thompson, Heaney, and Hickson, were all identified and tied back to the same conspiracy. For Creasey, the stop in Scotland was the moment it all fell apart. Years of service in the Navy and the police had once given him authority. Years later, that same knowledge had been turned against the system. But no level of experience could hide the fact that he had been caught red-handed, carrying heroin worth hundreds of thousands on Britain's roads. What followed was no longer about suspicion or theory. It was about evidence, charges, and the long process of justice that comes when a network is exposed. After his arrest in Scotland, Stephen Creasey's future was set on a path he could no longer control. The heroin in his car, the burner phone, the hidden compartment, all of it gave investigators the proof they needed. What began as one arrest quickly expanded into the full picture of a multi-million-pound operation. The case moved through the courts under the banner of Operation Solon. At its heart was the charge of conspiracy to supply heroin. Creasey was no small player caught on the edges. He was central to the transport of drugs, trusted by Liverpool gang leaders to carry their product across the country. That trust, once his strength, became part of the evidence against him. In March 2023, Creasey stood in the dock at Cardiff Crown Court. The court heard how he had been stopped with 5 kilos of heroin, worth hundreds of thousands on the street. They heard about the burner phone linking him to Brannan and Hopkins, and about the wider structure of the gang. His background as a former police officer was not just a detail, it was a sharp reminder of how far he had fallen. A man once sworn to uphold the law, now stood guilty of breaking it in one of the most serious ways possible. He pleaded guilty to conspiracy to supply heroin. The judge sentenced him to 12 years and 7 months in prison. For a man of 67, it was a heavy term, a punishment that would see him spend much of his remaining life behind bars. But Creasey wasn't alone. The rest of the group faced justice too. Brannan, Hopkins, and their associates were each handed long sentences. Together, the 5 men received a combined total of 57 years and 2 months. The gang that had moved £7 million worth of heroin was dismantled, piece by piece, its leaders and couriers alike locked away. For investigators, it was a success. The heroin pipeline that had stretched from Liverpool to Scotland and Wales was broken. For the public, it was a reminder of how organised crime works and how it can reach into unexpected places. Few would have imagined that an ex-officer, a man once part of the system, would become one of those helping to spread drugs across communities. The fall of Stephen Creasey is not just about one man making bad choices, it is about betrayal. Betrayal of the uniform he once wore, betrayal of the trust placed in him, and betrayal of the values he once claimed to defend. His story is a sharp example of how power and knowledge, when turned the wrong way, can do as much damage as the criminals he once tried to stop. From the Navy, to the police, to the prison cell, his life shows a rise, a shift, and then a collapse, the downfall of a corrupt gangster copper, told in full.